Hey, thanks very much for having me, you guys. My computer's just loading. I've never actually done a speech before, so these notes are actually quite important. I don't think this, I was too late sending the slides as well, alas. There's no visual aids. But yeah, super pleased to be here, alongside such excellent company. And yeah, I should begin by saying, as a reporter, I've always been mindful not to get into the business of speculating or making kind of subjective claims, but yeah, it seems fairly clear now, especially since, as Joe was saying, strict drug policies have been kind of dropped in certain places across the world, and it hasn't brought about an apocalypse, and actually seems to be pretty beneficial. But yeah, a law and order approach to drug policy clearly borders upon the insane, especially when you consider the likelihood that those laws were drawn up by folks who partake in the consumption of, well, drugs. And I'm not just talking about coffee, but tobacco, powerful pharmaceuticals, alcohol, and perhaps for some illegal drugs. These, however, are our drugs, at least in the kind of dominant white collective consciousness. Incidentally, I heard that 40 million worth of cocaine washed ashore near Aberystwyth last year following the conference. But I guess that just illustrates the chaos of this Wild West that's been brought about by prohibition. Even kava, a mild shrub from the Pacific Islands, was made illegal a few years ago. It's like, I think it's one beer is equivalent to about 5 cups of it. So yeah, who's at the wrong end of this madness? Well, it's people who are dependent on drugs and are forced to use stuff that's mixed with all sorts, concrete, other adulterants, and it is that kills generally, not the heroin, right? That's not causing a lot of the thrombosis and issues in the veins. But yeah, all of this nuance is a lot too complicated for many of the papers, afraid. Not The Guardian, I should add, but many of the others. And there's subtle factors which contribute to social exclusion, as well as you all know. But yeah, what's clear is that as a starter, testing drugs for purity is an obvious way to reduce harm. I went to Copenhagen, Denmark, and visited a safer drug consumption facility there. And yeah, the purity of the heroin had increased significantly due to this consistent testing. The kind of paraphernalia left in the streets had pretty much disappeared. And they say that there's never been a fatal overdose in the facility, as most, if not all, of the other such facilities across the world say. One social worker who worked there telling me said, "These people are really sick. They cannot just suddenly stop taking drugs. All we can do is make it as safe as possible, and if they decide that they want to give up." Yeah, it's difficult actually, because I was first interested in this because my uncle, he has always been addicted to heroin, so yeah, it's just difficult knowing what could be, But he's gone through the 12 steps, and he's been clean for a couple of years, so that's actually amazing. And yeah, most of the chaps, in this place had been through it. Most of them had either been adopted, gone through the foster system, or had come from Iraq, Afghanistan, and yeah, they just need a bit of empathy. But yeah, I was really glad to get this commission. It was through this Upside project at The Guardian, which focused on solutions journalism. Unfortunately, the funding's been used up now, but yeah, it was a great little project while it was on, and that's actually the reason I came to Swansea the last time, 4 years ago, to report on the city farms here. And yeah, another thing was, I met the crusading activist Peter Crichton, who you might know. I spent the day with him in Glasgow when he was doing his kind of guerrilla drug consumption facility in an ambulance, and these chaps that were coming, they were literally flabbergasted. They were no one's ever been nice to us before. They were just shocked, touched. At least one life may have been saved through the provision of the overdose antidote naloxone there. And yeah, Peter summed up the day's activity that day when he said, "There's now less discarded equipment used by people on the street where they're prone to bloodborne viruses. Everybody used their own equipment we provided. They all used hand sanitizers. And all I'm doing is trying to save lives. You've got to take a chance sometimes." And yeah, amazing stuff. The only unfortunate thing here is that Vice News, who I reported the story for recently, began to wind down and laid off most of their staff. So that illustrates just a few of the issues the media are kind of facing, especially since few publications are going to publish stories about street injecting, right? And what can be done about it for the good. And yeah, it's clear that the UK's policy is rapidly falling behind those of our European neighbours, even despite some police-led decriminalisation schemes. And it just makes sense. Like I visited this one diversion project in Reading with Jason Q, and yeah, even for the second or third or whatever offence, for very small drug offences, just get the kids in a room and get someone sensitive to speak sense to them. And it seemed to resonate with some of these lads. Obviously I don't know what happened next, but it seemed to resonate, definitely resonated more than the one night I spent in a police cell. It seemed risk radicalising actually. But yeah, it's generally considered by the Westminster metropolitan elite that progressive drug policy reform is kind of an unnecessary electoral risk. The academics Alex Stevens and Fiona Measham have hypothesised that new drugs are subject to increasing control through this kind of legacy of historical control, which somehow deems them as people use them as deviants or lunatics, and as kind of a ratchet that can't be loosened. Accordingly, the government just made laughing gas illegal, mostly used by younger people into kind of dance music. But yeah, like other prohibitions, it hasn't stopped people selling it. Police even looked on Saturday night in London as folks were, accepting card payments for them, and ridiculous, like £10 for a balloon. It's just all pretty crazy. I didn't take one, I should add. But yeah, the work of the reactionary press is kind of done in stoking fears of this kind of hippie crack. And yeah, now people on the ground have got to figure out how to actually implement this policy, and it doesn't seem like it's come hand in hand with any kind of harm reduction. And yeah, obviously comes after years of LSD, ecstasy, cannabis being portrayed as kind of insanity tablets. And on some level, I do kind of understand it. We got to be careful with this stuff, and it can trigger serious mental health episodes and paranoia, and if one has underlying schizophrenia. But there's obviously, as Joe's outlining, for most people, and especially done safely with the right prep and integration, it's going to be overwhelmingly positive. But yeah, in the media, I guess it's generally just much safer and commercially expedient to just focus on the negative. There's negativity bias. Yeah, as I said, I kind of understand it. If you're going to big up an organisation or an individual, who knows exactly what their story is, and yeah, it's just safer to focus on negative. And newspapers' editorial lines are influenced by the policies of the major political parties, who generally across the West don't support drug reform for mostly political reasons. And yeah, as I say, this has resulted in a steady stream of frankly scandalous journalism over the decades. And it's typically, people who are street homeless, mentally ill, or people of colour that have been at the brunt of this. And yeah, stories get spiked as well. It's unfortunate. I once received this commission to go up to Middlesbrough and visit this. It's kind of illegal, but they'd had the blessing from the local police and the neighbouring PCC. And I took an MP up there. And the chap was inspecting the weed, and there was a photographer. I thought it was a great story, but it got spiked with no explanation, even though it had been commissioned. So that was a shame. And then 2 weeks later, this influential House of Commons committee recommended decriminalisation. So that seems like a great peg for the story. But yeah, away from the front page of the Daily Mail, how significant is the stigma against people who use drugs in the UK? Out and about and in real life. It's obviously a real thing among segments of the public, but maybe not as much as initially thought. A 2022 YouGov study suggests that 40% of people believe that drug laws are too soft, but 20% think they're too strict, with the rest kind of neutral. And it is like, when you see some of this stuff, like the other day in Bethnal Green, like this guy was kind of aggressive, asking for money, and I got a bit of a weird vibe from him, like, that's kind of a product of prohibition, that he's not getting his needs met elsewhere. This has all happened over the last 15 years, got worse through deep cuts to the drug treatment budgets and wider austerity, and it's just an awful shame we haven't kept pace with Switzerland, Portugal, Denmark and elsewhere. And the UK government has repeatedly refused to follow the advice of its expert advisors. The Home Office won a 3-year battle against me earlier this year in a tribunal to suppress a report from its own expert panel that recommended drug decrim. And the contents of the report are only known because a former member of the council, Alex Stevens, who I mentioned, blew the whistle. Not to do too much of a sob story, but just to give an insight. I did this as a freelancer and I got 250 quid for the article. 3 years of investigating and emails and all sorts. But the struggle continues. Now that got resolved. I got a story out. I submitted another Freedom of Information request to try get this report, because now there's more information about it in the public domain, and the government's now published its 10-year drug strategy, so it can't really say that it's still under consideration, because you're not allowed to say stuff's always under consideration, because that's bollocks. But not to restate too much stuff that Joe said, but elsewhere in the world, drugs are being decriminalised apace, and I've covered how 5 cities in Massachusetts have pretty much decriminalised all drugs, especially to help with the opioid crisis over there. Decrim in Portugal, reduced drug-related deaths. Colorado voters have recently decriminalised all psychedelics, which is pretty incredible, and it is like a world first. And the opposition actually is pretty muted in the media, at least. And I guess the data's here, and these anecdotes from folks are there. There was a landmark debate on psilocybin policy in the House of Commons a week or 2 ago, and the MP leading it, suggested that of the thousands of people that take their lives every year could find respite through psychedelics. So it's really powerful, really promising. As Joe outlined, there's strong evidence, but perhaps compared to other pharmaceuticals, maybe there's a limited base, but the research is a lot more tricky to do, and it's a lot more subtle and more difficult to measure. But research is coming along now, and even the minister who got sent out to bat for the government, Robert Jenrick, said that they're going to try open things up. So at least on the face of it. I guess I had an experience. I went to the town where magic mushrooms were kind of rediscovered, and it's a really incredible story. They weren't known of in the West until the late 50s, when an amateur mycologist published an article in the precursor to Time magazine, in which he documented an indigenous Mexican mushroom ceremony led by a healer named Maria Sabina in a very remote part of Oaxaca. And his article prompted millions to realize that the mind-warping and consciousness-expanding fungi was all around them, and a global tide of discoveries from Alaska to Southeast Asia came about. And I thought that demonstrated the tremendous power of journalism, even if it very sadly caused many people to visit her village and really disrupt the social fabric, to say the least. And it seems actually in vogue now for celebrities to speak about their usage of magic mushrooms, and every time Chris Martin talks about it, or Justin Bieber wears a mushroom necklace, they get a lot of good press. So culture's really changing, and I think that's reflected in the media. I will just say one thing about Ibogaine, which I think in the context of today is really important. I'm told that the relapse rate is estimated to be around 50% in the long term, and people leave, with intense polydrug use dependencies in some cases, 85% leave the clinics without withdrawals. Really staggering. I went to one clinic, and the chap, one of them, was addicted to benzos. He was injecting fentanyl, which is like the hardest of the core. And he couldn't look people in the eye. He couldn't look us in the eyes. And I did my treatment with him, like next to each other in the clinic. And the next day, he was looking people in the eye, having a laugh and a joke, and doing yoga. That just seemed impossible. Like, and I don't know, like, what happened to him, but just that he wasn't shaking, right? Like, is really staggering. I mean, I think we do need to be careful with Ibogaine. It can cause cardiac arrhythmia, and people have died, and I don't think there's been enough publicity on that. But with the right preparation and weaning off, I think it's incredibly powerful and seems to really reset the pathways in the brain in a single trip like no other psychedelic. It's actually legal in New Zealand. Authorities have acknowledged it's reported to alleviate the symptoms of opiate withdrawal, and there's been lots of press on this recently. And what more to say? I mean, some of the clinics have been founded though by former drug dependent people who have found solace in Ibogaine, but have little of the training to run a successful enterprise. And I think including this flip side, which I don't feel was done in the How to Change Your Mind documentary. It's not just rainbows and butterflies, and folks, especially with drug dependencies, do have to be, really mindful. Like, even myself, like I've been to one or two ceremonies where I've, had really strong like experiences, like maybe even negative, and maybe that's just part of it. But it's definitely not rainbows and butterflies, and especially for people in a fragile state, that might send you really west. And I alluded earlier to the kind of ingrained negativity bias in the media, and when one hears about people smoking like 5-MeO DMT, it's probably the strongest psychedelic, in a pool of water with like supposedly experienced trip sitters, and seeming like they're at risk of drowning, as they were doing in this like popular documentary, just like it was normal to like do it and then fall back into a stream, is just crazy. And I think that also explains why there's maybe been a hesitance to highlight some of the extraordinary success stories, because it's just uncharted territory, and there is a lot of negligence, and people don't understand how to even identify the negligence, because it's just such a new thing. So just alongside like these incredible tales, I think there's going to be a lot more space, and that's going to be part of the pushback as well, I think, from the reactionary press. More and more focus on these stories as more gets out there, because there really are some crazy fuckers. Like even when we do, if psilocybin does get regulated, like in Oregon, they're just rolling out the treatment there. It's $4,000, for a mushroom trip, plus the prep, plus the integration, and it's not on health insurance. So who's it really for? And I think the tale of the botched medical cannabis legalization in the UK is kind of a cautionary tale for us here. It's a relatively cheap drug, and it's actually the bureaucracy and the hurdles that are being put into place that are really getting in the way. As I write in my book, drugs are being legalized both in statute books and in the hearts and minds of the people across the world. The war on drugs seems to have just made everything much worse, and while the regulation of cocaine and the prescription of heroin might not be the simplest things to achieve, there doesn't seem to be any other option, because no one's going to stop doing cocaine, or I guess going around the beaches of Aberystwyth with a metal detector trying to find these blocks from last year. And the media is generally kind of catching up with all of this, and despite everything I've said today, like, it's clear the drug policy is getting a fairer crack of the whip, even though Harry Prince Harry recently incurred the wrath of the Daily Mail when he was talking about ayahuasca and magic mushrooms, like changing his life recently. But then that might have like encouraged Ben Goldsmith, this kind of aristocrat CEO chap, to come out and say that ayahuasca helped him process the grief of the death of his daughter, and that got a big splash in the Times. So yeah, times are changing. So it's been good to be able to surmise some of the developments today and a bit of an insight into the crazy world of freelance journalism. And yeah, I've got a podcast coming out. It's called Uncharted Territory. So it'd be great if you guys could check it out. Thanks very much.